If you've been living under a rock for the past few months, Vector announced in February of this year as a brand new studio that were making us the Boeing 787. They have 20 plus team members, real 787 operators involved, pilots, cabin crew, ground crew, you name it, they are involved. The studio is headed up by Els or Ellie, who some in the community have suggested has a close association with InnyBuilds, though the extent of that relationship hasn't been made particularly clear. And if I'm honest, that's sort of the problem in a nutshell, isn't it? There's pretty limited information about who these people actually are and what credentials they actually have.
I call it schematic level. We've developed every single system to schematic levels. We're very confident we will meet the 2026 schedule. That's something the entire team is very confident about.
Okay, let's talk about that. Now, rather than just speculating about who they are, let's have a look at what they've actually shown us and whether any of it backs up what they've been saying. In particular, they showed us this. So to understand why this matters, you need to first off know something about how the 787's electrical system actually works, because in most ways it is a fundamentally different approach from every other commercial aircraft flying today, and that difference is exactly what is being shown here. On any other commercial airliner, whether that's your A320 or your 737 or your A330 or your 747s, whatever, the engines drive generators through constant speed drive units or CSDs, which are essentially a gearbox that keeps the generator spinning at a fixed rate regardless of how fast the engines are actually turning. What this means is that the electrical output is always a constant 400 Hz, making it stable and predictable, so every component on the aircraft is designed around that one specific number. But Boeing scrapped that entire approach on the 787. Instead, they connected the generators directly to the engine shaft, which means the output frequency rises and falls with engine speed. At cruise power, what you'll expect is anything between 360 and 800 Hz depending on the engine speed, whereas at idle, you'd have considerably lower. So there's positives and negatives to approaching it in this way, but what it means is that the Boeing 787 has a completely different approach to how the aircraft manages power. Now look at these values here, 542 Hz on each of the online generators, and this just shows us in some ways the amount of detail that Vector are putting into the aircraft. Because let's be honest, most developers would probably just hard code 400 Hz because that's what they're used to, or they wouldn't even model it at all. So them getting this right at least suggests to us that they at least know some of the intricate details of this aircraft like no other, and then knowing specifically what value is correct at this specific power setting. Now look here at the voltage readings. 270 volts DC on the ATRU buses, which again is something entirely unique to the Boeing 787. The 787 doesn't have a traditional pneumatic system. There's no engine bleed air for cabin pressurization or wing anti-ice or air conditioning. All that runs electronically. The only exception is the engine nacelle anti-ice, which still uses a small pneumatic system. On every other aircraft, the engines bleed hot compressed air off the compressor states to pressurize the cabin, de-ice the wings, or run the air conditioning, but none of that happens on the 787. Instead, everything runs off the electricity, which is why it needs this higher 270 volts value to power systems that other aircraft would otherwise run off bleed air. And then you've got two separate conversion paths coming off that main power bus. The ATRUs take that raw power from the generators and convert it into 270 volts for the big heavy loads like the hydraulic pumps and the cabin air compressors, and the TRUs, the transformer rectifier units, separately take that same raw generator power and convert it into 28 volts for the smaller systems, for example your conventional electronics and instruments. What this shows us is parallel paths which aren't feeding into one another, and then the lithium-ion batteries sit at roughly 33 volts, providing backup power when you need it. In fact, and some of you in the comments might be able to correct me on this, but based off of what I've seen online, the 787 is the first commercial aircraft to ever use lithium-ion batteries, which was also the cause of the fire incidents in 2013. All of it, however, is in this screenshot, all of it. You can also see R1, the right number 1 generator, is also disconnected. And if you look underneath, you can see the load shed box, which is showing us all of the affected systems and the order in which they're going to be switched off. When a generator drops offline, the aircraft naturally isn't able to sustain full power to everything, so what it does instead is automatically cut off lower priority systems in order to protect the ones that keep you flying. So the list that you are looking at right now, the window heat, the external lights, all of this is representative of how the 787's load shedding system works. While it's not exactly what you would expect in this particular scenario with an R1 failure, it's still promising that the system exists and that it's functional and that the aircraft is already calculating and displaying load shed states at all. And what makes this particularly interesting is that it's consistent across both displays simultaneously. The data page on the left and the synoptic diagram on the right are both showing the same fault state, the same shed systems at the same exact time. But of course, and I want to be clear, that in some ways, screenshots can be staged. You can set up a display to show a correct state without the underlying code actually doing those things dynamically. But I will say, to produce a screenshot this specific, with the right variable frequency values, the right voltages and architecture, the right load shed sequence, and those be represented on both displays at once, you have to know what correct looks like in enough detail to recreate it, which is a promising sign in itself. Either they've spent some serious time with real maintenance documentation, or they've had direct access to the aircraft. And from what Els has been telling us during the presentation at FS Weekend, it's probably both, to be fair. Next we have this screenshot that was shared with us, and I have to say right off the bat that the heat discoloration on the inner nacelle is just wow. You can see here the iridescence, the gold shifting to blue towards the exhaust cone, which is this thin film interference. What is happening here is that titanium and nickel alloys form an oxide layer at sustained high temperatures, and because that layer is thin enough that the light reflects off both its surfaces and the metal underneath, the two reflected waves interfere with each other. The colour essentially depends on the thickness of the oxide layer, and that thickness follows the temperature gradients across the exhaust cone. So what we can see here is that it's hottest in the centre and cooler as you move out towards the edges, so naturally the colour shifts with it. And if that's the case, it does at least tell you something. That's not just detail that you stumble onto. You don't accidentally recreate physics of oxidized titanium unless you either had direct access to photographs close up, or someone on the team understood what they were looking at well enough to go and build it properly. Either way, that kind of accuracy has to come from somewhere real. And it's also worth noting as well that they're committing to both the GEs and the Trent 1000 engines, which I don't think has been given enough weight in the conversation, if I'm honest. And then on top of that, we are going to get all three variants at launch as well: the Dash 8, the Dash 9 and the Dash 10.
Dash 8, Dash 10.
Yes, definitely. We are making all three variants. So we're making the Dash 8, the Dash 9 and the Dash 10.
All of which have completely different flight models with different weight distributions, different performance characteristics that have to be correctly independent from one another. That is a lot. Like, genuinely, that is a lot of work. And when I think about the fact that this project has been in development for what, say 2 years by the time that it actually launches, I do find myself wondering whether all of that can be done to the standard they've said in their own words in that specific time frame. Maybe it can, maybe the team size makes that possible, I don't really know. But if I'm honest, this is the part of the announcement that gives me the most skepticism in a way. Not because I think they're lying, but because of the sheer scope of work that they're committing to is just mind-blowing. And the scope is exactly where projects quietly slip away and the quality drops. But we're going to have to see. Hopefully they'll come out with more information in the future, and if they do, I'll hopefully do more on this. Next up, Vector showed us the windows, and I know that this sounds completely strange, like as a thing to be excited about, but bear with me just for a second. I actually didn't know this until I'd done some searching online, but the 787 doesn't actually have window shades, like none at all. What you do have, instead of reaching up and pulling a window shade, is pressing this little button at the bottom of the window frame and the window itself dims. What this is electrochromic glass. The way it works is there's a thin layer of gel sandwiched between the two panes of glass. When you press that button, It sends an electrical current through the gel, which triggers a chemical reaction, which changes how transparent it becomes. And as far as I'm aware, I don't think anyone in the flight sim industry has ever done this, like ever. Granted, that's probably because it's the first aircraft to use this sort of technology, but still. Vector are quite literally the first developers to have to solve this problem, which, depending on how you look at it, is either an impressive first or it's just inevitable. But solving it correctly with all 5 functional states, rather than just throwing a tinted texture over it and hoping nobody ever notices, still tells me something about how they're approaching the details. And if that mindset is applied consistently across the rest of the aircraft, that's exactly what schematic level is supposed to mean in practice. And then we had this screenshot. This is kind of where it gets a little bit more complicated in my eyes. So on first glance, everything here seems fine, right? The CDU layout looks right, and for what it's worth, there is Route 2 functionality in there as well, which is actually worth a mention because PMDG only added Route 2 functionality to the 737 for MSFS 24 and actually made a point of announcing it.
Anyone got any questions for Matthias? I don't know if we can...
I do.
Okay.
Could I ask how much your cup of coffee was?
Sorry?
How much was your cup?
It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
Vector has that in their first FMC screenshot, which is actually a good sign in itself. But look at the routing here. Every single waypoint here is on a direct leg. And the reason that this matters is because direct routing is genuinely one of the least demanding states an FMC can be in. There's no altitude constraints or speed restrictions or procedure legs, nothing that actually tests whether the logic underneath is working right. And arguably the FMC is the single most important part of any aircraft. It has to handle things like radius to fixed legs, turns, VNAV path calculations on a complicated descent with multiple constraints. It is the single hardest part for any airline developer, and that's what hasn't been shown here. Then, if you look at the bottom left section on the weather radar page, look at this gain value, minus 9,999. Gain on a weather radar shouldn't ever be reading as 9,999. It operates over a normal, meaningful decibel range, and that value doesn't correspond with anything in real life. To me, this probably just looks more like a placeholder that probably shouldn't have made it into the screenshot before it went out the door. And in fairness, this is probably nothing. This isn't anywhere near a finished product, it's not on our desks, and it's not in our simulators. You haven't paid any money for it, and it's still in active development. A stray value on a radar page during development is hardly something that you should be up in arms about and rioting about. But this was something released specifically as a showcase of the system's depth, and minus 9,999 is the kind of thing that gets caught before something goes public if the right people are looking at it more carefully. It just kind of made me look twice in a way. And it should definitely be something that we look for once the spotlights start rolling out and eventually when this thing actually gets shipped. They themselves said schematic level.
And the reason we go one step deeper is because I call it schematic level.
So naturally, that's the standard that we should be holding them to moving forward. That is just my 2 cents, but we can move on. At FS Weekend during the presentation, Ellie did say that the aircraft had over 700 pages of checklists and more than 200 maintenance pages.
We have over 700 pages of checklists, so that's normal and non-normal procedures. There's over, I think, 200 maintenance pages as well.
Not hundreds of pages or huge amounts, 700. Specifically, 700 was said. What she also said was that the team had spent 4 to 6 months just purely planning before a single line of code was ever written. And actually, we saw these. These are Vector's systems architecture planning sheets, essentially the map of every component that needs to be coded before development even begins. At least that's what I took from it anyway. And within each of these boxes that you can see here represents a system or a unit, something that has to be individually modeled. To be honest, there are a ton of them. What did interest me though is if you look more closely at this image here, there are 3 items highlighted in red. Spoilers mixing unit, flat slack control unit, alternative flat slack control unit. There's also this SG box in the displays section that's also red. And how I took it, and I could be completely wrong here, is that those red boxes are probably components or elements that aren't completely done yet, or at least weren't at the time of these sheets being made, which again is fine. Like, this is a planning document after all, and it's not a finished product. But look at the sheer amount on this sheet that are not red. The navigation suite with dual GPS, dual IRS, dual DME, dual VOR, Sceptical, full SATCOM with the SDU, transponders, weather radar, all of it is individually thought about. The 787 actually runs on 3 FMCs, and you can see all 3 have been thought about alongside dual CDUs. The auto flight section has 4 flight control computers. The fire protection section has every single smoke detector broken out and thought about individually. And then there's the CCS section at the top here. CCS, or the Common Computing System, is essentially the whole brain of the aircraft. And what the 787 did was replace the traditional approach entirely. Older aircraft had every system have its own dedicated computer, so all of them had separate components talking to each other in a way. What Boeing did was essentially replace all of that and share the processing power across multiple systems simultaneously. Then you'd have the Common Data Network connect all of that together alongside 21 remote data concentrators distributed along the airframe, collecting all of that sensor data and then feeding it back to the center. And that is probably the reason why modeling the 787 correctly is so much harder than other aircraft that's come before it. And it's on this sheet. 3 red boxes out of all of that. And honestly, when you put all of that together within the 4 to 6 months of pure planning that Ellie mentioned on stage, it starts to make a bit more sense. On the surface, that sounds like what you would do in most projects, right? Surely, for example, IndyBuilds or PMDG, they spend huge amounts of time preparing and researching and considering all of those finer details. And to some extent, probably yeah. And when you think about what Vector specifically is trying to build here, that planning time takes a slightly different meaning. And it is because of the persistence and MEL system that they described at FS Weekend. For those who don't know what an MEL is, it's a minimum equipment list, which is essentially a formal record of a known fault on the aircraft that allows it to continue operation under specific conditions. What they said is that faults carry between sessions.
One of the biggest things on all of the aircraft that the team have worked on is persistence. If you want full realism where you're handing an aircraft off to somebody else, then that is something we are looking into, yes. Yeah, so from the maintenance side, so again, if you have an issue with this generator here, you can write up an MEL about this particular generator, and if you have that option enabled, then if I took the aircraft from you and I go to the MEL list, I'll see that there was an R1 gen failure.
The maintenance pages are running on live data, and then you also have the circuit breakers that are resettable through the maintenance control pages. That all can't be bolted onto a half-assed code base through development. It just can't. For that system to work, the systems underneath it have to be modeled as genuine fault conditions from the very beginning. Persistence states that the aircraft tracks, stores, and restores correctly every single time. That is not a feature that you add near the end. So when Ellie said that there's been 4 to 6 months of pure planning, that is not some sort of marketing spiel that you've been normally used to. That is precisely the level of detail that you need to go into to create the architecture for something like this properly. And to me, that is one of the most quietly encouraging things that I took out of the whole announcement. So, best aircraft in flight simulation. It doesn't mean good for a new studio, or impressive given the timeline, or promising for a first release. It means you are better than what is currently out there, with deeper systems, more accurate procedures, and FMC that handles anything and everything that the competition doesn't. It is not a reasonable approximation of one. This is a specific, measurable claim, and Ellie has, in fairness, doubled down on it, especially when she was challenged on it on stage. So it's not something that can be, in my eyes, rolled back on quietly when the spotlights start rolling out. And I think that's actually probably a good thing. I think that's the right approach in a way. Set the bar high, hold yourself to it, and let the product do the talking in a way. I think the problem right now is that the product hasn't and arguably can't do much of the talking right now. 5 screenshots and a presentation or a Q&A isn't nothing, and I want to be clear about that. In fact, some of it, as we've shown in the video, been actually really encouraging. But it's also not enough to build any sort of trust right now. Not yet anyway, in my opinion. What I do know is that when this thing ships, we should measure it against what they actually said. Not against what we were hoping for, or against what we thought it would be, against the specific phrase of best aircraft in flight simulation, because that is what they asked for. And if you would like me to try and arrange some sort of an interview with Ellie, let me know in the comments. I genuinely would love to sit down with her and maybe go through some of the finer details, and we can see if maybe that's something that can happen. But until then, high hopes, open eyes, and we'll talk about something when the spotlights start landing.